Greetings. In this video, I'm going to be exploring and responding to parts of two recent videos which were put out by Benayah Israel. Now, before I get into this subject, I just want to say up front that although I'll be disagreeing with Benayah on a number of points, I hope it remains clear that this should not be seen as indicative of me having some sort of disdain for the gentleman. I continue to maintain a respect for Benayah, and I appreciate the contributions that he makes to these conversations. By the way, I haven't had a lot of interaction with Benayah, but the one time I got to have a direct interaction with him, it was a brief one, but it was nonetheless a direct interaction with him, was on Berean TV last November. And during that time, I took that opportunity to tell him basically the same thing, that although I disagree with him on a number of points, I hope it's understood that I maintain a respect for the gentleman.
Hey, shalom, family. Yeah, I'm catching bits and shalom, brother Jason. How you doing, brother? Hey, so hopefully everybody's doing good. Shalom to you.
I'm sorry, is this Benayah? This is Benayah Israel?
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on, sir. Let me just say first and foremost that, despite the fact that I've been disagreeing with your videos, I hope your posts, I hope it's clear that I respect what you've done thus far, and I really appreciate your two public posts on the subject, attempting to transcribe what was on what you saw on the Pews. I really appreciate that. I hope that's clear.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
So the two videos that I'll be looking at portions of are the two videos you see on your screen, and these two videos were joint efforts between Benayah Israel, Kelly Richardson, and William Brown, and therefore I hope it's understood that at certain points I'm going to be looking at past positions taken by Benayah or by Kelly Richardson or by William Brown, as I do think there's going to be a question of consistency. I think it's fair to ask about questions of consistency. Now, both videos are obviously meant to be arguments against the case for Arabic on the Pews. In fact, in many respects, especially in the second video, it seems to be even more narrowly focused on specifically my hypothetical case for Arabic on one particular pew. And so with that in mind, I think it's worth noting that, I'm fine with people arguing against Arabic on the Pews or saying that they don't think any Arabic appears on the Pews. I myself have maintained for over a year now that I'm skeptical about any language being on the Pews, including Arabic. And as a result, I've been teased a bit by Dante Fortson, who thinks that, I need to present a better case against Arabic if I'm going to take that position. Whatever the case, the reason why I bring this up is to say, in a vacuum, it's fine to present a case against Arabic on the Pews. But in light of the history of this discussion, I think here we should focus also on the question of the strength of the case for Arabic vis-a-vis the strength of the cases presented for Ge'ez and Hebrew, and ask if there's a consistent standard being applied here or if there are double standards. And so with that in mind, let's jump into a relevant clip. By the way, let me also say one last point of clarification. Benayah's videos, although mainly focused on linguistic questions, also had some material on identity questions. And I continue to think that we need to separate out the identity questions from the language questions, so I'm going to largely skip over that. That said, let's jump into the first clip I'd like to look at from Benayah's first video. Here we go.
Well, let's first take a look at the evidence. For this, we will visit a website created by Dr. Muhammad Rahim. On Dr. Muhammad's website, he briefly discusses the historical data behind a Muslim slave narrative. And his comments are all we need to put this into proper perspective. He says, and I quote, "Though the historical record is scantily populated with their history, it reveals that West African Muslims brought to America carried their Islamic faith and cultural practices with them." Now, notice that Dr. Muhammad stated that historical records were scantily populated. On Dr. Muhammad's website, he lists 5 examples of Muslim slaves in the area. However, a quick look at their enslavement reveals the unusual circumstances of their enslavement.
Okay, so I wanted to open with that particular clip because I think it's going to help me set the tone for much of this discussion. Now, having heard that, let me first say up front that yes, the number of examples we have of Muslim slaves in the Americas is relatively small. And likewise, the number of examples we have of slaves literate in Arabic is even smaller. However, did you notice the document that he has on his screen. Did you notice that piece of writing there? That piece of writing is popularly known as the Bilali document or the Bilali diary. It was made by a slave who was living on Sapelo Island in Georgia, off the coast of Georgia, in the early to mid 19th century, which is to say the early to mid 1800s. It's worth noting that the Bilali document is 13 pages long, 13 pages of consistent writing in the Arabic script. And with that in mind, I'd like to put forth, if I may, a bit of a request, maybe even a bit of a challenge. And it's this: for those who want to take the position that Benayah's video took, I would ask that they show an example of multiple pages of consistent Hebrew script written by a slave in early to mid 19th century Georgia. However, if one cannot provide an example of such, then I would invite them to consider that however minor evidence of Arabic literacy among slaves in early to mid 19th century Georgia may be, it is still more extensive than the evidence of Hebrew literacy among slaves in the same time and place. And that's important to note. That's worth noting because, yes, on the one hand, evidence of Arabic literacy among slaves in America is relatively rare and scarce. It's also worth asking relative to what precisely. It's not rare relative to the body of evidence in favor of Hebrew literacy among slaves. And that's important to note that, I'm not trying to deliberately accuse Benayah of being inconsistent. I'm not accusing him of being deliberately inconsistent, but I do think that he overlooked what might be considered a lacuna in the reasoning being applied here. We have far more Arabic writing for that time and period among slaves than we do for Hebrew writing. There is no Hebrew equivalent or Hebrew parallel to the Bilali document in terms of pieces of writing produced by slaves in that time and place. That said, let's jump into another clip from Benayah's first video. Here, listen to this.
Additionally, we see these Israelites also learn a little Hebrew on Sunday morning. Hebrew was part of the sermon and church documentation. For example, the following sermon preached to the First African Baptist Church congregation started off by teaching Hebrew. And the following reference reads, and it reads, "There are three words of Hebrew origin, of a kindred nature expressing different shades of meaning of a banner. Oath represents a small sign or banner. Nes, an ensign, a token of a thing. And degal, a flag, a banner, a standard from the verbal form degal, to cover, to glitter, and to shine, or lift up a banner."
Okay, so in this case, I'm honestly going to say that rather than that being indicative of a background in Hebrew, it relates more to their familiarity with English. And I appreciate that initially will sound like a strange statement, but I want to put some focus on the English language amongst that crowd, as again, I think there's something that's missed. Before we get to that, however, I just want to say that this is one of those cases that comes up where, sometimes you can look at a person's writing and feel like you have a decent idea of what their bibliography might be. And so to illustrate this, first, let me note that there was a word right after where Benayah stopped. The text, and it's right there on the bottom of his screen, the text that he's quoting from makes mention also of the corresponding Latin term vexillum. Now, just to be clear, he's quoting from Emanuel King Love's 1888 book, The History of First African Baptist Church. Okay, now this is a book that might have been consulted by Emanuel King Love or whomever else he leaned on. This is Smith's Dictionary of the Bible, and as is noted at the bottom of the page, this book was published 15 years before Emanuel King Love's book on First African Baptist Church. This book was published in 1863. Now, on page 558 of that book is the entry for ensign, and you'll notice that it hits all of the same terms which had come up in the book that Benayah showed, in the sermon that Benayah had showed, such as Nes and Oth and Degel. And also note that towards the bottom of the page, in the same entry, It's also mentioned the corresponding Latin term vexillum. And so that raises a question. Was the person who was giving that sermon speaking straight from their knowledge of Hebrew, or were they sort of leaning on a work like this? And that's what I meant when I said that you can see a person, sometimes you feel like you might be able to determine or discern the bibliography that a person had employed. But I think that's a minor point, but I wanted to make it because I wanted to sort of make this point that, some of these things are not, even when they're making references to Hebrew, it's not indicative of a background in Hebrew as much as it's a reflection of their English speaking environment. The statements that they made about Hebrew and Latin was a direct result of their English bibliography, it seems. And I'm going to return to this point about the significance of English vis-a-vis the methodology that's being employed by Benayah in a moment. And while this might seem like hair splitting, it's worth noting that Emanuel King Love's book, which Benayah appealed to, mentions Greek far more often than it mentions Hebrew. The word Hebrew only appears maybe 4 times in the book, and I think only half of those instances are referring to the language. Meanwhile, Greek comes up literally dozens of times. And for example, there's a point where when the book is discussing the Greek verb baptizo, it shows a number of different renderings of that verb, and it devotes several pages to looking at how different Greek writers, from Strabo to Josephus and others, employed that verb. So, the book devotes more time and more energy to Greek than it does to Hebrew. And again, this is going to be relevant in a moment. I'm going to explain how there's a logical point to be made here. But first, let's play one more clip from Benayah's first video, and then I'll get to the point I'm trying to make.
There's very little Arabic associated with the church. In fact, the slaves who built the church spoke very little Arabic. They were gullah slaves, which is a Hebrew word, by the way. An in-depth study of the Gullah language by Dr. Lorenzo Dow Turner revealed that out of roughly 4,000 Gullah words, less than 1% of Gullah words could be traced back to Arabic words. Let me say that again. Less than 1% of Gullah words could be traced back to Arabic words. In other words, these slaves weren't Arabic-speaking slaves. Nor is it logical or reasonable to hypothesize that a people who speak less than 1% Arabic could write whole Arabic words or phrases on pews at the first African Baptist Church.
Okay, my immediate question is, how many words did Lorenzo Dow Turner's book trace back to Hebrew? I'm confident that the number of words in that book which are traced back to Hebrew is far less than the number of words traced back to Arabic, however small they may be. Now, I know that some might want to special plead on behalf of Hebrew and say, maybe the author wasn't looking for Hebrew. But even that begs a number of questions. Here it is, you have one of the most celebrated linguistic studies of the Gullah dialect, and yet the scholar who produced that work didn't think to look for Hebrew characters. Why would that be, unless it's the case that the presence of Hebrew in the Gullah dialect is far less obvious than the presence of Arabic in that dialect, however small it may be? That's worth some food for thought. Now, let me offer an analogy to explore a problem I see with Benayah's tacit reasoning here. And once again, let's return to the Bilali document, which was mentioned earlier. This document was produced by a man who was living on Sapelo Island off the coast of Georgia in the early to mid 19th century. And at that time, Sapelo Island had many Gullah on it. Now imagine taking Benayah's tacit reasoning and saying that because there were many Gullah on Sapelo Island, and because only a very small minority of Gullah terms go back to Arabic, then this document, which was produced by someone on Sapelo Island, can't possibly be in the Arabic script. With all due respect, the reasoning would be bad. However minuscule the amount of Arabic that may exist amongst the Gullah, that doesn't preclude someone walking into an area where Gullah may be present and producing something in Arabic. And that's clearly shown by the Bilali document itself. And here's another question that needs to be asked. How does one know who made a given marking and when they made it? In my experience, there's some who claim the markings were made before the pews were built. For example, in that Boom Church panel discussion from last November, William Brown proposed that the markings were made on boards first, and then the boards were inserted into the pews. However, others claim that the markings were made after the pews were built, for example, by visitors who were moving along the Underground Railroad. And this hypothesis was presented to me by Orthodox Moor and Anonymous Hebrew, in which they proposed that different persons would come at different times, and these were people from a variety of different linguistic backgrounds, and they would leave different markings. Now, with that in mind, how do you prove that either proposition is actually the case? I don't see how that can be done, and I don't think it's proper to simply assume one or the other. Now, if you can't rule out that second proposition, then making appeals to, for example, the Hebrew that was used in the beginning of a sermon by C.H. Lyons would strike me as having questionable relevance, because it begs the question, are you claiming that C.H. Lyons specifically, Reverend Lyons, marked some particular pew, like, for example, the pew that Arabic reading has been proposed for? If we don't know who made the particular markings on a pew, then it seems strange to say, that we know that person didn't know any Arabic. That's awkward. Like saying, I have no idea who made these markings, assuming they're man-made markings. I have no idea who made these markings, but I do know that they didn't know any Arabic. It seems impossible to make that statement. And again, we do know that there was some Arabic literacy in Georgia, so I don't see what rules out the possibility of someone literate in Arabic moving through that area and stopping by briefly. That's also worth some food for thought. That said, I'd like to offer another analogy, and in this case, I'm going to circle back to English and why I thought it was important to point out the prevalence of English. I think people take that for granted, and therefore they see it as strange that I would even bring that up. But nonetheless, it's going to have some relevance here. Remember this pew, which Benayah originally proposed, had two chets in the Solitreo script. Some of you may remember that from last November. Now, also recall that those same markings, rotated 180 degrees, were described by Professor Ephraim Isaac as possibly having two Ge'ez characters. And so, now, I would also note that they just as if they look like the relevant Ge'ez characters, they just as easily look like Greek characters. It looked like an omega and an upsilon, right? And they also look like characters, Latin characters from specifically the English alphabet, specifically W and U. So now let's apply some of the reasoning that's been tacitly applied in the clips that we looked at. Is Greek more prevalent than Hebrew in Emanuel King's book, the history of the First African Baptist Church from 1888? And the answer is yes. Greek is more prevalent than Hebrew in that book, and also Greek is more prevalent than Ge'ez, that's for sure. But you know what's more prevalent than Hebrew, Ge'ez, and Greek combined? English. And so what if I propose to you that these two markings have to be characters from specifically the English alphabet, because English was so prevalent. It was by far the most prevalent language at First African Baptist Church, in the sermons that were given at the church, and in this book by Emanuel King Love that was written about the history of the church. English is by far the most dominant language. And so too with the Gullah dialect. You want to talk about Gullah, what's the main base of the Gullah dialect? English. English dominates there as well. And so imagine arguing that because English is by far the most prevalent language, these characters have to be characters from the English alphabet. Now, if one wants to argue, that's not necessarily the case, I'm fine with that. But then you're introducing a new rule. The rule that you would be introducing goes like this. The prevalence of a language does not determine whether that language appears on a particular pew. So give that some thought. You know, if you hold that how prevalent a language is determines whether or not it appears on a pew, then you have to lean towards these markings being English characters from specifically the English alphabet, Latin characters as found in the English alphabet. However, if you think that a less prevalent language can have a presence on the pews, a language that's less prevalent than English, then you basically undermine this argument that's presented against Arabic that tries to say that Arabic can't be on the pews because it's less prevalent. Think deeply on that. And that pretty much covers what I wanted to say about the first video. Now I'm going to turn to Benayah's second video, which was accompanied by this YouTube community post. And in this YouTube community post, he lists 4 points against the case for Arabic. And, I appreciate him doing this because it does pretty much sum up the salient arguments in this second video he put up, the salient points that were brought up in a discussion between William Brown and some unnamed scholar. And that was the bulk of Benayah's second video. And of these 4 points, I'm honestly going to say that at least 3 of them are pretty much covered in previous videos of mine, but at least one of them does need further discussion. And so I'm going to return to this list after looking at the relevant clips. So here's Benayah's second video, and as I said, it's going to have an interview, William Brown interviewing some unnamed professor of Arabic. I'm going to pick up at about the 31-minute, 35-second mark because I think that's when they really start to get into the arguments against Arabic appearing on the pews, or more specifically, my hypothetical case for an Arabic reading of one particular pew. So let's pick it up here.
Okay, so let's move on here. Let's move to the hypothetical because, we wanted to cover all bases. So, and I want to quote what you said in your email. You said, I am hesitant to agree with the hypothetical image. The name of the Surah 114 is Al-Nas. In Arabic, it looks this way. And of course, brother, and I think this is the sin. Am I correct here?
Yes, that's the last one. Yeah. So we start from right to left. Yes, sir.
Right. We read from right to left. So, and then you says the letters in the markings are not connected as they should in Arabic. A native speaker of Arabic wouldn't write it that way. Also, people write verses from surahs and not the names of surahs. What did you mean by that, Professor?
So again, the 2 reasons that I gave, one is a linguistic reason, and one is a cultural reason. The first one, like I mentioned, it's not connected, and we can talk about that later. But the second one is more of a cultural, let's say, and then here we're talking about, Arabic in connection to Islam, most, if not all, writings on any kind of artifact, wood, leather, gold, silver, stones, whatever it is, when you look at it in the Muslim world, it's either the name of God, okay? The name of the prophet, praises of God or praises of the prophet, or verses, verses from the Quran, sentences. In the Quran is I'm sure Mr. William. It's a book of chapters, and each chapter we call it a surah. So a chapter, let's say, is the modern way of calling it. In Islam, we call it surah. A verse, we call it ayah in Arabic, that's a verse. And that's what people will write on their artifacts, because the verse was important to them, not the name of the chapter, not the name of the surah, For example, An-Nas is one of the most important, not to say that the other ones are not important, but one of the most important surahs in the Quran, because it's short. It's very short. It's a short. Every kid in the Arab or Muslim world will know it by heart. It's one of those first surahs that you learn as a kid. So again, for anybody who's Muslim, I don't see why they will write the name and write the whole chapter, because it's just like 2 verses or 3 verses. It is very, short, or at least they can write a verse from it, and there are very, important verses in this surah that can be written in calligraphy that people will have in their houses, will have in their offices, will have give as gift, whatever the case is. But I have never seen an artifact where the only scripture or the writing on it is a name of the chapter.
Wow.
It's not. People don't do that,
Wow.
Wow, indeed. With all due respect, that segment, as long as it was basically arguing against a straw man, as I never argued that the text simply has the name of the surah. The professor, now, to be careful here, I'm not accusing the professor of deliberately attacking a straw man. Rather, I think the issue is that, William Brown didn't share my actual argument accurately enough with the professor. But just to be clear, my argument was never that simply the name of the surah appears on that pew. Rather, just as the professor said, rather than the name of the surah, they would have at least one ayah, at least one verse from that chapter. And that's precisely what I proposed. I proposed that most of the text in red, resembles verse 3 of Surah An-Nas, which reads, Ilahin Nas. So that covers that. Now let's get into this next clip, but let me say up front that I think this is going to be one of these cases where we need to take into account previous positions taken by members of this team of, either Benayah or William Brown or Kelly Richardson, because I think the criticism that's put forth by the professor is fair, but the criticism being echoed by William Brown is unfair at best and outrageous at worst. But here, listen to this.
I would think you would have to look at every marking on there to try to bring it together if it's really saying that.
No, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Go ahead.
But I agree with you. I agree. You have to look at every little details. I believe to make that a judgment. And I agree with you when you talked about these markings, like those 3 slashes.
Yeah, right here.
If you want to, right there. Again, we have dots in Arabic, and we have symbols, okay, in Arabic. So dots, of course, dots are part of the letters, okay? They're just part of the letter. Some letters will have dots in them. Some might have 2, 3, below, above. Anyway, any letter, is different than the other. But you will see a lot of dots in Arabic. We also have symbols that we put on the letters. And some of those symbols are either vowels, or absence of vowels, or, for example, emphasis, a lot of, we have about 12 symbols in Arabic. None of the symbols that we have, and there are 12, will look like these 3 things that we have in the middle, those 3
right.
things that you showed me. We have double, something like this, if it's just the 2 of them, double, we do have those in Arabic, but we only put them at the end of the word, not in the middle, not in the beginning. And that's what, again, brings me back to say that it's probably not Arabic, because, again, I think the most important thing for me here that I'm looking at is the 3 kind of symbols on the top,
Right.
That, again, if those are symbols, those are not Arabic symbols. They're definitely not dots, because they're not, So if they're not dots and if they're not symbols in Arabic, what are they, And that's what, again, make me kind of hesitant to say, there's some of what this gentleman said that might make sense in some parts, but some parts doesn't add up. And that's why I'm like not 100% sure to say it is Arabic.
Okay, as I alluded to earlier, I think this is a fair criticism coming from the professor. It is true that I never proposed an explanation for what those three lines might be. However, that criticism being echoed by William Brown strikes me as unfair, as hinting rather loudly at an inconsistency in his approach, because him and Kelly Richardson proposed that they alluded to the fact that you don't have to explain all the markings on a pew because different markings on a single pew could be made by different people. That's literally the position they took. In fact, they even got the cat's persona to echo that. And, to illustrate this, let's take a look at when Kelly Richardson tried to interpret this same pew. And notice that not only does he ignore those three lines, he ignores more than half of the rest of the markings on the pews, isolating just the center part. Take a look at this.
The first error is assuming that this pew was written by one person. If he would have done the proper analysis on the pew, he would clearly see that there was at least two people or two different tools used to write cursive Hebrew or solatrio on these pews. If you zoom in on the writings, it's obvious and it is supported. The yellow writings to the left of your screen is me writing out the highlighted section of the pew.
Did you catch that? Did you notice how practically with just a wave of his hand, he declares more than half of the markings to have been made by somebody else? He doesn't actually present a case for that. It's just declared. And that sort of provides his excuse for ignoring more than half of the markings on that pew. Now, think about how when Brown was examining the case for Arabic on that same pew, he was saying that, you need to look at everything. But that wasn't their position when they were proposing a solitreo reading for that pew. And I think this is a rather glaring example of double standards, of uneven scales. When you're proposing Arabic for this pew, you have to explain every single marking. When you're proposing solitreo for part of the pew, you're not under any obligation to explain every single marking. Moreover, if one is allowed to just hypothesize that a certain set of markings that are difficult to reconcile with your main text were made by somebody else, then you could propose all sorts of things for those three straight lines. For example, that could be the number 111 for all we know. Or note that when Kelly Richardson endorsed the statements of, and celebrated the statements of Ephraim Isaac in the documentary Cryptic Quest, he highlighted the fact that Ephraim Isaac had discussed the possibility of, even if there's no words within a set of markings, it could just be magic. It could just be repetitions of letters, something like that. But if you're proposing that, then why couldn't this just be, three olives, But here, let's actually see what Kelly Richardson celebrated in terms of explaining how Ge'ez is on the pews without any sort of coherent terminology being there. Listen to this.
So far, none of the letters, symbols, or markings seem to form words, which may imply that they had a different purpose entirely.
The use of alphabetic symbols in magic is very well known, it's very ancient. In Ethiopia, already in the 4th and 5th centuries, they were using decorative letters, not directly in terms of symbolic 3 or 4 words, letters, but in terms of a geometric figure. A lot of the early magic, what we call abracadabra, they are not complete words, but they are letters. One prayer that they use just a few of those words, and sometimes it's maybe just like ha 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 la 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 ba 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 da 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 da. This is of course the way of enticing the demon and defeat.
Okay, let's try to make sense of that. Dr. Kelly basically insinuated that one can triumphantly celebrate Ge'ez being on the pews as he did, even if there is no coherent Ge'ez phrases, because even if there are just markings resembling random characters floating somewhere, one can simply, attribute that to magic. The tacit argument here, collectively, between these different videos, is that the case for Ge'ez is not required to explain everything, much less present something coherent. However, the case for Arabic is required to explain everything and present something entirely coherent. And that's a glaring example of a double standard. This is a glaring example of uneven scales. But nonetheless, let's ask this question. If you're going to appeal to, magical formulas and talismans, employing Hebrew script or Ge'ez script, are you going to say with a straight face that there was no magical formulas or talismans or anything like that made with Arabic script? And are you saying that if these magical formulas using Arabic script do exist, that they couldn't possibly have a series of straight lines? Is that really the position you're going to take? And let's make note of the fact that once you open the door to this sort of reasoning, to this sort of mode of explanation, it doesn't require that a slave even be particularly steeped in magical symbols. The slave who made some markings might have just been vaguely reproducing something they saw decades earlier. Like, even that would be a possibility. And so the positions that Dr. Kelly and others have taken to sort of support their positions undermine this sort of argument that was just presented against the case for Arabic. Moving on, this is the Wikipedia entry for grigri, which is a type of, a West African talisman. And the entry has an image of a grigri that was made by a fulla. And this particular talisman uses Arabic script. So let's take a closer look at this and tell me if you don't get the sense that the goalposts have been moved within a single month. Because at one point, Kelly Richardson was alluding to the fact that, you don't have to explain everything and you don't have to have something coherent because, hey, it could just be magic. You could just have these random symbols being used as magical formulas. And yet the goalposts are moved and now a different standard is applied to Arabic. I'm sorry, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Oh, and by the way, before I get back to the other portions of Will Brown's interview with that secret Arabic professor, I want to make a point here about the evolution of this discussion over roughly the last year and a half. You see, back in my very first video from October of 2019, I had made the comment that if you're claiming there's coherent language on the pews, then you should be able to demonstrate it. However, it would be a different case if you're going to claim that it's some sort of an esoteric message or some sort of a secret code. As was stated earlier, yes, some of the markings on those pews might resemble a Hebrew cursive character. Some of them might resemble a Greek character. Some of them might resemble an Arabic character. But the mere resemblance to a single character here or there does not establish that actual language is present. I don't see any discernible statements in Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic or Greek or whatever. Now, someone might reply that it doesn't matter if I don't see it or not, and that's fine. But for those who are asserting that either Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic is present, they should be able to demonstrate this. Demonstrating the presence of a language is not an esoteric art, or unless it shouldn't be, unless someone's going to argue that this is written in some sort of cryptic code. And Kelly Richardson, when he put up a response later that week to my video, he barely responded to anything, but he did respond to that, insofar that he affirmed he is not endorsing any claims of any sort of esoteric messages on the pews.
So I want to make that clear, and no, it's not from some esoteric approach to it, some mystic. No, I don't believe in any of those things.
However, now, not only is he invoking magic, but he's even literally invoking secret codes.
Also shared secret codes and the meaning of each one of them.
Oh man, what a difference a year and a half makes, huh? But whatever the case, let me get back to Will Brown's interview with the secret Arabic professor, as here they're going to get into the letter seen in my proposed hypothetical reading. Take a look at this.
And so when I was having this conversation with the calligrapher, right? And so we were looking at this and he was telling me about all of these blotches. Like here, you have a blotch here, you have a blotch here, you have all of these different things. And he blew them up And he said, when you look at this, and I know in the hypothetical, there was a connection to make this a sin, but he says here, if you look at the marking here, the way it starts here, it loops around to here and it ends here. There's a space in the between this, which indicates, he said, that's probably a blotch in the wood, the same way the blotches are around the inscriptions. So he says this is more than likely a blotch because of the fact that they end almost looking like a horseshoe in a way. It ends here, and you can clearly see here that there's a blotch here in the wood, but also here, these lines here are not connected. They're not connected.
Okay, so I've alluded to this in a previous video, but I'll attempt to go into slightly more detail here. Look, when someone is scratching, allegedly, assuming that the markings are man-made markings, when someone is scratching or carving characters into wood, it's not like painting on a piece of paper or writing with a pen and a piece of paper that's laying flat on your table. You see, and you can attempt this, like get a bunch of people to try to make carvings that are, let's say, roughly a half a centimeter wide. So, you know, sort of like what we see there, using, I don't know, a half a centimeter worth of a knife blade or a flathead screwdriver or something like that. What you'll find is that while some people can be quite talented with carving markings into wood or scratching markings into wood, lots of people are going to have trouble making consistent movements at different points. So there would be nothing surprising about a person trying to make a single character but having to use multiple strokes, which is to say having to start and stop along the way. And, you know, the little graphic you see on your screen is an attempt to illustrate that you might write part of it and then stop and then pick up where you stopped and continue with the rest. So you might need 3 strokes to make a character like a final scene. Testing 1, 2, 3. As for this claim that there are spaces in between portions of the scene, I don't see that. I'm willing, as I just did, to concede the possibility that there were starts and stops. You know, someone made it partially way through the character and then, you know, picked their tool up for a second and then put it back down and finished the character off. That's certainly possible to me, but it still looks like the person was picking up exactly where they left off and thus intended a continuous character like, you know, a continuous character like the scene. Whatever the case, let's now get to the last segment of the interview I wanted to look at. It's in which they propose that if the word is nas, the scene should not be connected to the alif. Here, take a look at this.
Here in this particular letter, these two shouldn't be connected the way the hypothetical was presented. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, yeah, I think the last one, I would agree with it, because this letter right here that you showed, I'm sorry, I'm trying to use the arrow. The second letter, the kind of the one that goes up. That long or tall letter that goes high, you know, goes up. Right. That's what we call a one-way connector. It's not supposed to be connected to what comes after it. So I agree with this person that you quoted here, that these two shouldn't be connected, you know? So right. Yeah, so this one doesn't connect to this one.
So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to a Google image search and I'm going to put in the phrase Khat al-Islami. Oh, actually, sorry about that. Let me also put in Surat an-Nas. And this is what we get here, right? So this is the actual Quranic text. And notice that at the end of verse 2, the scene in Malik nas is not connected to the alif which precedes it. However, in the third verse, the scene does overlap with the alif, just like happens on this pew, in this hypothetical Arabic reading for that pew. So to sum up, yes, of course, it's, you know, in proper written Arabic, the scene is not supposed to connect to an alif which preceded it, you know, but nonetheless, let's not pretend like that phenomenon is totally unheard of. It does happen in calligraphic and quasi-calligraphic forms. On top of that, it also could be explained that the person who made the markings ran out of space. Again, it's not easy necessarily to carve something into wood, especially if you're new to the process. So the person may have misjudged their distance and wound up going across the aleph by accident. There's a number of possibilities, and none of them are entirely absurd. With that, as we begin to wrap up, let's return to that YouTube community post that I mentioned earlier from Benayah, which lays out 4 points in an argument against the hypothetical Arabic, which was proposed for a particular pew. Here's what it states. Point 1, Arabic is never written with 3 symbols in the middle of the letter, as shown in the proposed Arabic script. Now, my response to this would be that we need to be clear as to what rules Benayah and his team are playing by. Are they now positing that each pew's markings can only be part of a single coherent unit and can only have been written by a single hand, or are they still open to their previous positions that, a pew, multiple people can contribute to a pew, and, one set of markings on a pew can be unrelated to another set of markings? I wonder what their actual position is on that, and if they have a coherent position, a consistent position on that. Moreover, do they still hold to the position alluded to by Kelly Richardson, that it's possible for symbols to just be random characters as part of a magical spell? Is that still on the table, or did they take that off? Because it seems like the rules are changing. How one answers those questions will have a direct effect on how one interprets those 3 lines that they feel are so egregious. But for all we know, that could be a number. If you really want me to propose something, I don't see why it has to be some sort of a diacritic on top of a letter or something like that. It could be unrelated. Whatever the case. Point 2, Arabic letters and words, except for 6 letters, are attached. Most of the letters in the pews are not. I disagree, at least insofar as when we're discussing the specific pew, which was under discussion. Now, I can't comment on all the pews, but with regards to that specific pew that we've been focusing on, it seems to me that the characters line up perfectly, just about. For example, the final scene at the end of Maliki Nas would not be connected to the alif in Ilahi Nas, which is to say the scene at the end of verse 2 of Surat An-Nas would not be connected to the alif at the word that follows at the start of verse 3. The alif would not be connected to the lam in ilah. The lam and the ha are connected in this proposed reading. The only thing that seems a bit off is you could argue that the lam is not connected. The lam in the definite article of an-nas is not connected to the nun, but you could also posit that, again, this could just be sloppily written, because it's not like writing with pen and paper. Trying to carve letters, trying to scratch letters into wood can be difficult, and there can be slips of the tool and all sorts of those things if a person is not familiar with the process of carving markings into wood. And let's be honest, a lot of these markings do look quite sloppy. And then beyond that, the aleph, that sums it up. I think for the most part, the characters connect precisely where they're supposed to. Point 3, in Arabic, they don't write the name of the chapter of the Quran on artifacts for remembrance. As I noted earlier, this is essentially a straw man, as I never proposed that the text is simply putting forth the name of the chapter. I propose that it's putting forth a very specific verse, that being verse 3 of Surat An-Nas, which reads, Ilahin Nas, the God of mankind. And this was also arrived at by 3 different scholars who looked at it. One confidently asserted that's what it says, and 2 others hesitantly proposed it as a possibility. So it doesn't strike me as absurd. And finally, point 4, the letter shown at the end of the proposed Arabic inscription is attached to the letter that isn't attached in Arabic. Arabic isn't written that way. Yes, properly, the sin should not be attached to the alif in Nas, but it does nonetheless happen. It's not something that's totally unheard of or unprecedented in Arabic. It can easily happen with calligraphic or quasi-calligraphic forms, and it can also happen just, again, with someone who's having difficulty carving this neatly into the text. The hand can slip, a person can misjudge the amount of space they have and wind up touching by accident. It's not like you have erasers when you're carving things into wood. And then this final statement at the end, it says, with that in mind, the question has to be asked, how did the church conclude it was Arabic when the writing on the pews violate basic, fundamental Arabic syntax? with all due respect, I'm going to try to state this respectfully, but I recall that not too long ago, just last November, Benayah and the rest of his team was endorsing the idea of a Hebrew phrase on one of the pews that went from left to right and had a number of other curious aspects to it. So, in the politest way possible, I do sense a bit of irony here. As I begin to close this video here, it's worth noting that at the end of, or at different parts of Benayah's first video, Kelly Richardson proposed a couple of readings, but I'm sensing a lack of confidence that, unlike what existed last November. You see, what he suggested first was Israel with a Zion and 5 yods. And then he also suggested 4 consecutive kafs, which may or may not be Hebrew. Instead, it could be in Sibidi, he said. Here, consider these 2 very brief clips.
Yisrael. Here's another example of a pew with Insibidi symbols on it. This cluster of what appears to be the Syriac block letter Kaf in Hebrew means palm of hand. The numerical value is 20. In the Insibidi language, this symbol means trek, journey, voyage, tracks.
Yeah, Israel with a Zion and 5 yods, not 1 or 2 or 3 yods, but 5 yods is, it should be obvious that this is completely ahistorical and barely coherent. As for the 4 kafs, if he was proposing that this is a string of Hebrew characters, it wouldn't seem particularly coherent. But he's also saying it's in Sibidi, so I'm guessing he's saying that maybe it only looks like Hebrew, but it's actually in Sibidi, or maybe he means to say it's both. I don't know. It's not very clear. But of course, a lot of the previous methodological questions come up. Like why couldn't that also be is ha, or or an English letter U, because again, remember how dominant the English language is. Whatever the case, it's these sorts of proposals are a far cry from what we were being told last November when it was being asserted that they had entire sentences.
Y'all put out a challenge that he must be able to decipher a coherent word or sentence on there. Now, we got it for you. We got this for you. So this what you wanted. We gonna give it. We gonna give you what you want. So Abu asked, "Can we find a coherent sentence?" Well, yeah, we just did, and not only that, we got a scholar to back it.
I'm not sure what to say about these developments, about this evolution in their position, but I guess I could say that I look forward to seeing where it goes from here. And as always, I always look forward to the comments of others. Comments are always welcome. God bless.